Well, as President Obama is in his old home of Illinois today, there he is, he's been riding around the Midwest on a $1.1 million bus paid for by taxpayers, unveiling a plan to convince them he's focused on creating jobs. Oh, yeah, and it's not a re-election campaign tour. Wink, wink. We'll have more on that in later shows, but while Obama is trying to save face with Americans, his second in command is trying to save face with Beijing. Joe Biden, vice president, is on a 5-day visit in China, trying to reaffirm the U.S.'s status as a world economic power, fresh off, of course, the debt ceiling crisis and the downgrade of U.S. credit. But is the U.S. losing out to China economically already? And what's more important, a country's principles or economic interests when it comes to these issues? Let's take a look at what's going on with oil in Canada as an example. So the U.S. imports about half of its oil, and Canada is the largest foreign supplier of oil to the United States. That's followed by Saudi Arabia, Mexico, and Venezuela. Now, Canada's only major oil export market is the U.S. Okay, now enter the vast reserve of oil in oil sands in Alberta. The U.S. views this as the pillar of its future energy needs. Now, it's building a pipeline to deliver it, but here's the problem. It's been stopped up by environmental concerns and regulations. Also, this oil from the oil sands is known as dirty oil, and environmentalists are not fans. Meanwhile, as the U.S. lags in just what it wants to do, someone is very willing and eager to step in. It's China, and they're willing to spend big money for a big piece of these oil reserves. And check out how the leaders in Canada have changed their tune in general towards China now that it's looking to the Asian country as a customer for its exports to pick up slack from the economically challenged U.S. For example, back in 2006, Prime Minister Stephen Harper said, "I don't think Canadians want us to sell out important Canadian values, our belief in democracy, freedom, human rights. They don't want us to sell that out to the almighty dollar." Back then, Harper was very critical of China's human rights record, and the foreign minister back then accused China of industrial espionage as well. Now, fast forward, the Harper government calls China a friend, an important ally, saying things like, "It is clear that the strategic partnership between Canada and China has never been more promising. As the structure of the world economy changes, more and more we are in a position to cooperate for our mutual benefit." Human rights? Not such a big rallying cry these days. How things change. So what's right and what's wrong, and what's going to win out here? Joining us to talk about that is host of Freedomain Radio, Stefan Molyneux. Thank you for being with us. Now, you are sitting in Canada. So let's first take Canada's flip-flop on China. What is more important, principles like human rights, which Harper stood for back in 2006 so valiantly, or economic interests, which Canada seems to be more interested in now when it comes to China?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think there's a bit of a false dichotomy. I think it's really important to remember that human rights are the issue or the business of the Chinese government, whereas people who want to trade and do business together, these are economic or property rights or free trade rights. So I don't think that we want to punish people who want to trade in Canada and want to trade with China for the actions of their government. I think that would be quite unjust. So I think that there's a fair amount of value in allowing this kind of open trade between the two countries.
So do you think essentially that it's the right thing for Stephen Harper and his government to be putting economic interests before values that they seem to really care about as the foremost priority before?
I think it is reasonable. I think the way I would phrase it is to say that it is good for the government to not interfere with the free choice of trade between individuals.
Okay. Now let's bring in the U.S. So the former foreign minister of Canada said this about the U.S.-China dynamic. He said, "There's a real sense in Canada now that the Americans take us for granted and that Canada has to strengthen relations with China in order to get more respect in the U.S." Do you agree, and do you see this oil sands issue as an example of that?
I think it is important. I think that there's a certain amount of delusion around energy requirements and energy production, particularly in America. So, for instance, almost 80% of the oil around the world is either owned or controlled by governments, and the vast majority of those governments are not very friendly either to their own people, to human rights, or to the environment as a whole. And so if you want to do business around oil, you're dealing with 21% of private companies, 58% of those are in Canada. So if you want to do free trade around oil, you have to go to Canada. Canada is Alberta, and the majority of 97% of Canada's oil reserves are in these tar sand projects. So I do think that China wants to do business in Canada. They are Canada's second largest trading partner. They are the main source of Canadian immigration. There are very strong ties between the two countries. They need energy. Canada is sitting on massive resources of energy. American special interest groups, particularly hyper-environmentalists, seem to be, I think, inordinately concerned about the environment, which, you know, we all want to have a clean environment, but let's look at the reality, is that if America does not get its oil from Canada, it's going to have to go to the Middle East or someplace in Africa or some other place where there's some godforsaken government oppressing its own people. So it's not like there's some magical solution where you can get clean oil perfectly with no human rights abuses. I'd like to think that Canada sits at the top of the human rights compliance regimen relative to almost all the other countries that produce oil, at least to this quantity.
Okay, well, let's get a little bit more into that, because you brought the U.S. into this conversation with the environmental concerns. So you have the U.S. saying, we don't know about these oil sands because of the environmental issues. This oil is dirty. The pipeline could pollute drinking water. And China just jumps in, says, sure, we'll take it. We don't care about those things. And they seem to have a model that they use more broadly that's driven purely by business interests, with less concern over the environment or that kind of thing. Which is working better in a country's interests? Because you mentioned that, you know, if the United States really wants oil, should they really be this concerned about the environmental concerns of bringing it from Canada?
Well, I don't think so. I think the environmental concerns are pretty questionable. There's a lot of flack back and forth about whether it's better or worse to have this kind of oil pumped through the U.S. Is it better for the environment as a whole to have it produced in Saudi Arabia, where there's almost no concern for the environment whatsoever, and then shipped in dangerous supertankers across oceans with storms and lightning? I don't know that that's necessarily a big improvement. The question with these kinds of decisions is always compared to what? So we can get, the American can get some oil from Canada, compared to what? Compared to shipping it from Africa and doing what China is doing in Africa, which is laying down lavish bribes to dictators to get access to these resources. We have to make intelligent decisions about how these resources are going to be gotten. I think that dealing with Canada, which has one of the strictest environmental controls on the planet, dealing with Canada with private companies who have profit motives and are controlled by shareholders and consumers, that is the best and cleanest way to get your energy. Going over to the Middle East, which is significantly anti-American and is going through significant upheavals at the moment, I think is not going to be a winning strategy for America in the long run.
Philosophically, you mentioned, okay, you gave the example of China, and you said they lay down lavish bribes to African dictators to get oil, that sort of thing. So in a situation where China puts business interests, in your example, ahead of any concerns about human rights or what a country's leader is doing to their people, that sort of thing, is that making them more successful than a U.S. model that puts concerns about what a country's leader is doing or what the U.S. considers the right human rights record or environmental concerns ahead of its business interests? Who's winning, China or the U.S.?
Well, I think from a purely economic standpoint, it's clear that China has experienced the most extraordinary growth since the early parts of the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe. So China's growth has been 7, 8, 9, 10% for almost 20 years. So there's no doubt that getting out of the way of people who